Today I'm going to present 150 views of the 150th Estonian Dance and Song Festival that I took in Tallinn, Estonia in July of 2019. But before I start the presentation, I wanted to take this time to convey some special thanks. First of all, to Peeter Põldre, the host of today's evening, who remembered that on March the 18th of 2020, mine was the first presentation that had to be canceled due to the pandemic. Secondly, I want to thank Kai Gilaspea, who over 10 years ago entrusted me with a media pass for Eesti Elu, Estonian Life, that has enabled me to participate in these various events. And finally, to my good friend David Dumptik, who for years has been able to post my various photo galleries onto the Eesti Elu, Estonian Life website. And the 1024 is an indication that when I came back from Estonia last year, he was able to very quickly post 1024 of my pictures from Estonia's Song and Dance Festival. I also want to take this opportunity to thank my role models and teachers. The fabulous trio of Toronto star photographers, Richard Loudons, Steve Russell, Rick Madonic, from whom I have learned through their seminars and workshops, as well as every day seeing examples of their photo magic in the paper. Thank you to all of them. These presentations typically begin with a review of the photographic gear. And here very briefly, for those who are interested, my Nikon D850 body, 2 lenses, the 24-70, 80-400, as well as an iPhone 6 camera for various panoramic shots that I'll share with you. Getting accredited actually started in 2009 for me, my very first Song and Dance Festival. And at that time, I had to have a legitimate media pass, as well as provided a portfolio of pictures that I had taken of various similar events. Since that time, I've been able to participate in 2011, 2014, and the process that started for 2019 in February of the year was actually relatively straightforward because of my past history and good behavior during my previous episodes as an accredited photographer. One had to walk around with the media pass as well as a wristband showing press at all times to be able to get into some of the special locations. It was really important to understand the role of the foreign media liaison person. In this case, a lady by the name of Maris Heldrand, who, as you can see from the slide, is fluent in 8 different languages. She was able to provide us every day with at least 1, if not 2 emails, telling us about upcoming events, locations, timing, and any special provisions that we needed to be aware of. Maris herself has a very interesting history. Earlier in her career, she was the executive assistant for Estonia's first free independence president, Lennart Meri, and then thereafter served as an advisor to Toomas Hendrik Ilves, who at that time was the foreign minister. First lesson, arrive early because it does get crowded. These next images are from the Festival Flame arriving in Tallinn's city square. Positioning is everything. And I wanted to have the wall of the City Hall Square in the background as the presenters were speaking at the podium in front of me. So what I did, as you can see already well in front of the rest of the people, I was able to get to that location about an hour early, spoke to the security guard and the policemen who were guarding the podium area just to get a sense of what was going to happen, who was going to be standing where, and also chatting with them, in effect, establishing my place in that particular location so that I wouldn't be crowded out later on. I found this to be a particularly useful step to take. The photographer beside me, Lasse Tur, is a professional photographer from Norway, and I shared many shooting opportunities with Lasse over the course of the next several days. And as you can see, I chose the right background. On the left is the mayor of Tallinn, and on the right, the mayor receiving the festival flame from Hirvosurva with the city hall in the background. I then moved away from that position just to show what the rest of the scenery looked like. And as you can see, the podium where the conductors were conducting from would have been in a good location when I was in the original position. Here's a picture of Hirvo Surva conducting. And this next picture may seem very dramatic, and you might wonder where I could have possibly been to take this picture. Well, in fact, I was right at Hirvo's feet, but not during the performance. This was a picture that was actually taken during the rehearsal, at which time there wasn't any problem in getting into a very awkward position, which I never would have been able to accomplish during the course of the performance itself. Another benefit of arriving early. And if you look around, we were able to see some familiar faces. Here's another example of arriving early. This is 6 o'clock in the morning as I'm walking up to Dompia, the Parliament buildings. And there to be early for rehearsing prior to the event. The event was going to be the flame coming from the top of the Parliament buildings and going onward into Tallinn. So during this early morning light, I was able to get some very nice pictures of rehearsal by being extremely close to the action because it was a rehearsal. There were actually only a few other photographers there at this particular time. And as you can see, one gets some very nice pictures and people are willing to pose. Estonian folk dancers from Toronto may remember that a few years ago, Liina Lillipuu Ero joined us in Toronto when she was doing her master's thesis on the history of Estonian folk dancing in this part of the world. And here again, the rehearsal is going on, just some wide angle shots before the actual event began. And a lovely opportunity to capture everybody in nice, soft morning light before the actual event. By this time, the flame is now down on ground level, and I'm having to be a little bit further away, but I wasn't particularly worried because I had enough of these pictures, especially some from the rehearsal. Here, the flame is now leaving toward the front of the Parliament buildings. And here's a picture in much harsher light compared to the earlier group photo as the flame is about to depart. Again, the benefit of arriving in a location early. Now, photographers for these kinds of events always have the eternal balancing act of deciding when to shoot wide angle, when to shoot close. And in effect, it's the difference between anywhere from a 10mm lens to, in my case, as much as a 400-meter lens. And we'll start first of all with the Folk Dance Festival, or Tantsupidu. Over 10,000 dancers participated in this event. And the photos that I'm going to share with you were taken at 3 separate performances. We had special media seating in regular seats during the dress rehearsal, and then we were free roaming at the 2 subsequent performances that I was able to attend. The accredited photographer locations are shown here with various yellow markings. Anywhere around the rails was fair game for accredited photographers. But of course, as you can see from this particular image, those rails were crowded, typically 3 or 4 people deep. Those people that were either in the audience and wished to be at the rail, or oftentimes dancers who were not dancing at that particular moment. So it was very crowded. Open seats. Interesting to note that for many of these large-scale events, an accredited photographer is allowed to be in any open seat as long as he or she is not displacing a paying customer and as long as they're not disrupting the enjoyment of the event for people who are sitting around them. For this particular event, there were essentially no open seats, so that was completely irrelevant. And finally, at the foot of the staircase, a very special location, ground level, there were only 4 of these locations in each corner of the dance floor, and we were given limited access to those for only brief periods of time. This is an overview shot taken with the iPhone 6 panorama camera, just showing Kalev Stadium, the main sports facility in Tallinn, Estonia, as well as a very partial number of dancers on the dance floor at this particular time. This picture is taken wide angle just to illustrate for people who haven't had the experience what it looked like to have virtually 10,000 dancers dancing at the same time, with the audience practically outnumbered by the dancers, given the size of Garden Stadium. The next four images give you a sense of the benefit or lack thereof of getting closer. And I chose to take pictures of the rhythmic dancers just to illustrate the benefits of wide angle, which showed the relationship of the dancers, the number of dancers, and their relationship to the audience, to getting slightly closer as they were leaping in air, to getting even closer to focus on three of the ladies, and finally, from ground level, being able to focus essentially on one of the rhythmic dancers. Capturing folk dancers from a photographer's point of view looks for precision, looks for beautiful patterns, looks for the interaction of partners, as well as the personalities of the individuals involved. And because it is an action activity, looking in this particular case for hops and jumps and twirling skirts. Here's a picture of Lassie and I now at ground level, one of the special locations for accredited photographers. And the yellow star indicates the staircase, because not only was this a boundary for us, but this is the staircase from which dancers came and went onto the dance floor. The space that Lassie and I are standing in is essentially the fully restricted space that we had. We could not depart in any direction, including up onto the track or to either side. So very restricted, simply so that we wouldn't be obstructing the television cameras and the overall enjoyment of the audience of the event. And here's an example simply of the beautiful patterns and colors taken from ground level. Wind and flowing hair for the dancers. There's nothing as beneficial as a little bit of wind when capturing folk dancing. Both faces of the dancers on some images, sometimes the woman's face, and sometimes the man's face. This is an example of a group of dancers exiting right in front of us. Easy photo to take if you're at the right location. And again, a similar picture, a men's group dancing right in front of us at ground level, and even showing some action. And always it's interesting to look for the younger dancers, because they oftentimes will show the enthusiasm of youth during these performances. Here's an example, a close-up of one of the lifts in dancing. And one might wonder why you see a lot of professional photographers clicking away at 6 to sometimes even as many as 20 frames per second. Here's a nice picture of two dancers leaving the dance floor, but a sixth of a second later, you notice that their eyes are open. And I think that you'll all agree that although this is not a bad picture, as humans with eyes open, this is a better picture. That's the benefit of clicking away at 6 or more per second. Here's a higher level picture that I somewhat facetiously label as educational, so that for people who aren't familiar with Estonia, they'll be aware that not every Estonian woman is a blonde. I like this wide angle picture, particularly because I was able to capture the precision of the rows that you can see the dancers in the middle of the dance floor forming. And here are some action pictures, some hopping, and you notice how almost exquisitely perfect the alignment of their feet is. Another example of some more youthful dancers. The twirling skirt that I referred to below. More twirling skirts, very easy photos to take. The flowing skirts, the precision. And luckily, the Vancouver dance group, who was in the middle of the field and actually very hard to find, but in reviewing my pictures afterwards, I came across at least one picture of the Vancouver group dancing. And some real close-ups, and interestingly enough, my daughter Christina was eventually able to find out who this lady was in this picture. And I understand that she was actually thrilled to be able to get a copy of this picture. As mentioned before, the younger dancers are always interesting to take pictures of. And now we talk about Toronto's Kungla folk dancers. So this was a formal group photo taken of them beside the actual dance floor as they were preparing. And on the first evening, I positioned myself at the rail away from the flame of the festival. And I was barely able to make out from this particular perspective, even with my 400mm lens, our group right at the outer perimeter, but not a terribly good quality picture. So the next morning, I went and positioned myself where they were, not surprisingly, right beside the flame, and began to try to take some pictures, only to discover that there were bushes in the way. And I tried to nudge myself around the railing, through people, politely if possible, but somehow I was able to maneuver myself into position, perhaps because I did have a media pass, to start taking some better pictures of people that weren't totally obstructed by the bushes. And it did get eventually better with some patience, as you can see with these following pictures. And then finally, toward the end of the second last dance, I was to capture these pictures of all 16 of Toronto's Kungla dancers dancing Ma Hing, Soul of the Earth, with its concluding pose such as this. And folks, I would recommend that if you want to have just a glimpse of what these dances look like, I would suggest capturing this YouTube video by a group called 40s TV. And the last two dances from 1 hour 55 onward are well worth looking at. If you were to go into YouTube and type in XX40s, you should be able to get to a 2 hour and 13 minute clip. And starting from 1:55 will give you the last two dances, Ma Hing and the wedding dance, Dulyak. Next, I wanted to spend some time showing you the procession, or Rongkek, a group of 45,000 plus individuals walking from Freedom Square to the Song Festival Stadium on the second last day, the Saturday of the festival. And first of all, these are some pictures taken by Kathy from an apartment that my daughters Annalise and Christina were renting, just to give a sense of what the procession looked like. Many Estonians will recognize this location, the Viru shopping center, the Viru Hotel beside it. On the right side in the purple is the Nordic Forum Hotel and the beautiful skyline of medieval Tallinn in the background. And here's another picture showing the mass of marchers coming down the street with Tallinn in the background. Now, this is the beginning of the procession. And as you can see, accredited photographers had no difficulty in getting multiple pictures of the very beginning of the procession, including a lot of the key conductors who were marching at the very beginning of the procession. Now, I chose this particular location for a couple of reasons, but most importantly, I wanted to have the beautiful pale yellow of St. John's Lutheran Church in the background. And so here's a couple of examples early on of why I just tested out this particular location to get St. John's in the background. Now, photographers always worry about being unlucky when they choose to position themselves. And here's an example. At this particular moment, the festival flame held in the hand of the lady on the right is being passed on to the main conductor of the festival, Peeter Põldre. And you can see that the experienced professional photographers are on the appropriate side so that their image can actually capture the flame itself. Here's a better example, just showing the major participants with their backs toward me and lots of experienced photographers on the other side. But I did find that although one may think of this as being unlucky, Eventually, if you wait long enough, people will turn around and you can get these kinds of charming images also from that position. Now, why this position was important is indicated in the lower left-hand corner. What I actually found was the TV platform. And I've often found that wherever the TV camera is oftentimes a really good spot to be taking still photos with. And in addition to that, I was able to sit up about a half a meter from the surface and spent several hours in this particular position taking pictures seated as opposed to having to be standing. This picture is of the famous Tartu University Academic Women's Choir, and I'll share some details about this particular group later on. Here are pictures of both the Toronto Gungla dancers on the left and the folk dancers from Vancouver, the Kilplaset, on the right. Now, before the profession, our groups from North America typically gathered at Freedom Square, and it provided a wonderful opportunity, hopefully, to get everybody together, as well as take these group photos. So this is the group from New York, Saravikat, and we agreed to meet at this particular location at 4 o'clock, just as they were about to enter the procession. And sure enough, they were able to pose very nicely for this particular photo. Here's a picture of the Tartu University Academic Women's Choirs, one of the finest choirs in all of Estonia. I made arrangements with them to meet at 12:30 p.m., and this photo was taken 2 minutes later. Well organized, everybody was there, and they were in the early part of the procession. And we want to always take these kinds of pictures with some kind of recognizable background. In this case, the large cross in Freedom Square. Here are pictures of the Toronto and Hamilton groups. On the left, the Toronto Men's Choir, and on the right, the Hamilton Estonian Mixed Choir, again, with very obvious backdrops to be able to capture the moment of where they were. Here's a picture of the Toronto Academic Mixed Choir, Nightingale or Öbik, again with St. John's Church in the background. And here's a picture, 2 pictures in fact, of the Estonia Choir. And the point made here is that as best as one tries, one has to recognize that these dancers are coming from various parts of the city and may not always be able to make it to a particular point in the right time. And so one has to be flexible as a photographer to capture 1 take, and if necessary, 2 or even 3 takes to be able to maximize the number of people that are actually going to be in the photo for you. Family and friends. So one of the obligations that I took upon myself was to make sure that I was able to capture pictures of my cousins in the upper photos, as well as friends. And in the lower photo, in the middle of the photo, is the reservations manager for the Nordic Forum Hotel. These commitments took a lot of time. And in fact, as the stick figure, as a reminder to me, over the course of this particular Saturday, I walked a total of 19 kilometers, most of which was actually taken up trying to find the family and friends as they were entering the procession. These pictures are all taken not during the procession itself, but as they were preparing from various parts of central Tallinn to enter the procession route. And now the Song Festival, or Laulupidu, which this year included over 30,000 singers. The accredited photographer locations were actually very special. There were 4 alleyways or walkways indicated by the yellow markers, as well as a special location that we were allowed under certain conditions to occupy immediately in the front row, seated on the ground in front of the VIPs right behind the podium. There are also 2 major towers looking over the Song Festival Stadium. The tower on the left, which is typically called the radio tower, was unavailable this year for accredited photographers. It was totally occupied by the Estonian television network. The tower on the right, typically called the Flame Tower, was accessible to photographers. And that generated the following panorama picture. You can see there is a fire burning somewhere in Tallinn on the right-hand side. The Song Festival Stadium, including the large stage area, as well as the audience. And for people who weren't there and who may not understand the scope of this particular event, at its maximum, there were over 35,000 singers on the stage, including, of course, the area behind the podium because they couldn't all fit on the stage, as well as on Sunday, a maximum of 90,000 people in the audience to the left. So in total, on that particular occasion, roughly 1/10 of the Estonian population was in this one location. And probably most of the others were watching on television. And here I've superimposed a different view of the photo locations. On the far left with the smiley face, in the shadow is the tower from which I was taking these particular pictures. In the middle is that special area right in front of the VIP seating in which we had to be kneeling or sitting on the ground taking pictures toward the singers. And the heart shape is a very unique position that I'm going to talk more about in the very near future. Here's a panorama picture as best as I could take it of the 30,000 plus singers. And you can see that many of them are actually behind the podium. And when they were looking at the podium, they had to actually have their backs toward the audience. Just a couple of pictures just to sort of show the scale of the singing. This is toward the end of the festival. And again, as you can see in the foreground, in order to see the conductor, people in the front of the stage actually had to look backward. Some sunset pictures. And now a bit more description about the unique position that accredited photographers were able to obtain. And I'll start first of all by sharing a picture of one of my chaperones, Annalie. And what the chaperones had to do was they had to bring us as accredited photographers to these restricted locations that were really no more than about 2 square meters. Only 3 other photographers were allowed in the same area. And the chaperone had to supervise us if we were moving from one area to the other. Now, unlike folk dancing, it was a little bit more difficult to capture certain kinds of action with singing. The most important action, of course, in singing is captured with an open mouth. There were also occasions when the hands had to be up for the singers. One tries to capture interesting faces, conductors in action, and toward the end, I'll share with you various images of flags. So the faces of singers. Remember that taking this with a telephoto lens typically means that only one face is going to be sharply in focus, hopefully including their eyes, which are always critical to have in focus, and the others surrounding them will be out of focus. I like this picture particularly because the cap illustrates that this gentleman is a veteran of many song festivals. Here's a picture of Hands Up with a very eccentrically placed young lady, just to add a little bit of color to the picture, otherwise just illustrating the action of Hands Up. Another very typical picture, open mouth singing, beautiful young girl with shiny blue eyes, hopefully in focus from the photographer's perspective. Another similar picture. And this picture, although she doesn't have her mouth open, I was particularly entranced by the perfect match of her glasses frames to part of her costume. Hands up here. And this interesting picture, which is almost humorous because on the surface, it looks as if he's wearing 2 caps. Of course, he's not. It just happens to be the angle at which I took this picture. And we captured some familiar faces. Toomas holding the Canadian flag, Paul holding the Estonian flag. Another familiar face, Ulo singing with his mouth open, and again, a cap illustrating a veteran. One must appreciate that within these particular limits, one could only really capture a very small handful of faces. When you were able to capture these faces, they were extremely lucky, but of course it limited the ability to see more than a small handful of individuals that could be in any way recognizable. The same principle comes from these larger group shots. I remember with some degree of humor, back when I first started shooting pictures at the Song Festival, some people said, could you make an effort to try to capture me while I was singing in the crowd? Well, these are 400 millimeter photos taken from relatively far away to try to capture as many faces as possible. And what I began to do back 10 years ago was to actually zigzag scan and simply take pictures randomly without any awareness of who I was capturing. When I then came home and began to look at them on the big screen, I was able to hopefully find some familiar faces. And I know that you don't have time to study this particular image for familiar faces. So just to make it easy for you, here she is, Estonia's conductor Ingrid Silm, as the one face that was able to be found in this particular large picture. I didn't forget to take pictures of the orchestra. And this was a particularly interesting picture because it showed that the song sheets and the scores that they were working with actually had a significant typo. The typo indicated that the Song and Dance Festival was going to be taking place in 2018, and the correction in red ink was to 2019. Tubas are fun to take pictures of. And whenever taking close-ups, it's so important to try to capture some emotion in the eyes, as seen in these pictures. Looking toward the audience from these special locations, one could get a very nice glimpse of the major song festival conductors, awaiting their turn to get to the podium. And then once they're at the podium, these special photographer locations offered what I thought were really very, very interesting emotional pictures of the various conductors. And I'm just showing a very small sample of them. And here's a picture that illustrates that autofocus can sometimes work and sometimes not. And it turned out, I think, to be a rather humorous picture of this conductor's hand and tuning fork with another conductor in the background. Toronto-born Riho Maimets, and the master conductor of the entire festival, Peeter Põldre, and well known to Toronto and Hamilton singing groups, Triin Kok, the conductor of the Tartu Academic University Women's Choir. And one has to admit that as dispatched as one wants to be, even an amateur accredited photographer can be starstruck. And here are just a couple of examples. Composer Denise Mägi, the former president of Estonia, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, the current president of Estonia, Kersti Kaljulaid, and I was particularly pleased that this picture taken handheld with a 400 millimeter lens enables one to actually read the entire text of her speech. And I was starstruck by this particular image. This is a famous Estonian photographer, Kaupo Kipas. Just a couple of days before the Song Festival, I was able to visit his exhibit, reproducing the pictures of Ansel Adams by his travels in the Western United States at the Pärnu New Art Museum. And I was absolutely thrilled to be able to meet Kaupo as we were both shooting from these particular special locations. And I was especially thrilled that my cousin, who's also a professional photographer, gifted me a signed copy of Kaupo Kipas's work on Ansel Adams. Now here's a story with a little bit of a negative feature to it, awaiting the laurels. As in years past, at the end of the festival, right below the podium, the laurels were given to various major participants in the event. And probably 24 of us gathered, sitting on the ground, waiting for those laurel presentations to occur. And unfortunately, probably because of the television camera desires, the laurels were actually presented to the major contributors at the foot of the area where the orchestra sat. And as you can see from this picture, there was some kind of nasty, thick wire that cut across this particular area. And as you can see here, this is the Beren's getting his wreath, and the wire cuts directly across his neck, making all of us very frustrated that all of these images that we were shooting from what we thought was the right place were essentially worthless. Now, I put a little note here about editing ethics, because typically for photojournalism, the only editing that is allowed for pictures that one takes are, first of all, cropping, secondly, minor changes in exposure, and maybe a bit of sharpening. It is really not permissible to use various editing tools to actually erase something like this particular wire, unfortunately. Just an interesting picture of reflections. I always like looking for a shiny tuba, just in case one can get an interesting picture showing, in this case, the two towers, the orchestra in the foreground, and the podium, as well as the mass of the audience in the background. I call this series of pictures a lucky find, because as I was standing in that 2-meter location, one's eye caught this young girl who was the daughter of one of the orchestra members. And she was a little bit tired, but holding a nice Estonian flag. So I clicked this particular picture. And then a few minutes later, I saw her again, and there she is, looking rather seriously, well-dressed, beautiful little bow tie, and holding the Estonian flag. But as one could imagine, for a child of this particular age, sometimes these events do get a little bit tiresome. So I call that threesome my lucky find. Some moments in time just to share. Images like this were actually quite common. Somebody dressed up, ready to meet with a group, and checking, of course, with their smartphone in terms of how things were going. Before the procession began, people waiting to get into line, and many Estonian photographers love looking for these pictures of women from southern Estonia with the enormous jewelry. It was typical for folk dancers to just practice on the street for fun, waiting for their turn in the procession. And during the procession, if a child happened to see a mother or a father, it was not unusual to see them coming to greet the person in the procession on the right from the stands on the left. Little girls holding bunches of flowers. Quiet moments for the directors. Special moments around the podium, Riho Maimets and ldre. The directors, the conductors celebrating. And this picture, which is one of my all-time favorites, of a young girl, probably with her mother or grandmother, the beautiful hair, the braids, and the special Estonian rukkilill, or in English, the cornflower. Sunsets. This was at the end of the dance festival. A sunset picture of the flame on top of the Song Festival Stadium flame tower. A view from the back of the Song Festival Stadium as the sun was setting. Some pictures of the weather, just to remind us that it was not always sunny. Clouds were brewing. This was on the Friday morning of the dance festival. And by the time the festival was over, it was actually pouring rain. Wind is easy to capture, especially when you have pieces of clothing that illustrate how windy it was. And then, of course, for those of you who are selfie fans, this is a selfie taken by my daughter, Christina, showing us drenched and walking away from the performance of the dance festival. I call this picture and the next one plan patience, because sometimes one just has an idea that it might be interesting to stand in one place to see what happens. And for about 10 or 15 minutes, I stood looking at the back of the Song Festival Stadium, waiting to see if anything interesting or anybody interesting would be coming toward me or away from me. And I captured this matching threesome of laurels as they were walking toward the Song Festival Stadium. This picture was particularly meaningful for me because I embedded myself at the very front of the Canadian delegation, and I'd planned this picture for many hours, hoping that I'd be able to get an uncluttered picture of the Canadian flag entering the Song Festival grounds. And I was very lucky to be able to capture this particular picture. Steve Russell from the Toronto Star, in one of his early workshops with me, talked to me about the concept of jubo. As you can imagine from that particular word, it's capturing some element of celebration. Wide open mouth, eyes shining, or in many cases, hands that are up. All photographers look for jubo pictures, especially with sports and action events. Here's another example, the conductors jubilant at the end of their performance. A composer and singer, and another one of our famous conductors, Trinko. And even in the audience, a famous Estonian from Toronto, Andres Raudsep. And finally, images of blue, black, and white, the Estonian flag colors, whether it was on a little child in a cap that they were wearing, holding flags, which was quite common, the flag and the flame, the flag in front of the Parliament buildings, the flag framing a singer, and toward the end, of course, the flags waving as the final songs were coming to an end, with the twinkling in the background. Sometimes the flag deliberately out of focus if there was somebody potentially even more important that needed to be in focus. And then finally, a couple of words about the sparkling lights. Those of you who have been able to attend in person know there's a special magic to the sparkling lights that everybody has on stage as the Song Festival is coming to a close. And I must say, I've always been disappointed and continue to be disappointed at how I'm unable to capture that image as well in a photograph as in person. And here's an example of something that shows that there are all sorts of little lights going off, but I don't think it really captures the moment as well as being there in person. But what I decided to do was to actually put on my telephoto lens, and I captured this final image of the Estonian flag and the source of the sparkling lights. And it struck me that it would have been very interesting to imagine for our ancestors 150 years ago to think that 150 years hence, in 2019, instead of candles, instead of torches, the sparkling lights would come from something called a smartphone. And I'll conclude with some final thoughts. It was certainly an honor and a privilege to take these photos. I was grateful for the help of the volunteers, the staff, and the photo colleagues who helped me along this journey. But it was indeed stressful, especially to capture the Canadian role in this activity. It was physically exhausting. At times it was mentally exhausting, but at the same time it was mentally exhilarating. And most importantly, it's been wonderful to be able to share these results with you. So I thank all of you, and to my Estonian friends, aitäh. Go.
No nii, suur aitäh. Many thanks, Peeter, really. It was a very interesting story of a photographer to follow, but it brought back so many memories and emotions, I'm sure, for everyone who were in Tallinn for this huge celebration. But now it's time for some questions or kudos or whatever you want to say, Peeter. That's the time. Oh, we can read here. Elagu Kungla, Vancouver, wonderful, haruldane, suur aitäh, Peeter. But yes, if you want to say something, you can unmute your mic so we can hear you. You don't have to type. You can say. I saw there were some of Peter's teachers joining our talk here. Maybe they would give some comments of the work of their pupil.
So Peter, Richard here. Hello.
Hi there.
Lovely work. That was awesome. So nicely done. That's not easy to do, I know. So the question would be, would you do it again? We know you did the first time, but would you do it a second time?
Well, it would be a fifth time for me.
Or fifth time?
And
but this comprehensively, I mean.
Yes. Yeah. If I was to do it at all, I couldn't imagine not doing it. As I've gotten older and my knees aren't quite what they were before, I've actually thought about this question a lot, and I would certainly do it again, but I would find ways of making life a little bit more comfortable for me. I won't share all the details, but certainly the access to that unique spot, I would continue to ask for that all the time. Get on the right side of the chaperones and say that I just constantly want to be in that spot, because to me, in comparison to previous song festivals, that was really the most unique location that one could get. And even though it was only 2 square meters, 360 degrees around that 2 square meters gave what I hope you all will agree were some really interesting and wonderful pictures, especially of the conductors. So yes, indeed, sign me up again 2 years from now for the Youth Festival, hopefully 4 years from now for the next one.
Yeah.
And so thank you so much, Richard, for all you've taught me and for being able to join us tonight.
Oh, it's lovely. I wouldn't miss it for anything. No, I didn't have to teach you anything. You kidding me? So you know what you're doing. So, but one other quick, I don't want to monopolize, but one other quick question for you. Is there any equipment that you should have brought and any that you brought that you didn't need? And now I'll turn myself off so nobody else listens to me anymore.
Perfect. Great question. And I must say I was completely pleased with my choice. The gear that I was carrying around was not light. And from a physical perspective, I wouldn't have wanted to have any more. Now, in the meantime, I've got an iPhone 11 Pro, so that's going to be even better iPhone. But I think that the combination of the 2470 and the 80-400 is just an amazing spectrum to work with. So I didn't regret that choice at all. And as you saw, by the way, in some of the pictures that were taken, the picture that Kathy took of me and Lassie, I also had a monopod. Because when I was shooting down at ground level at the dance festival, it was very useful to have the monopod to hold on to. I didn't use the monopod during the song festival simply because the space was so confined and I probably would have poked somebody's eyes out had I tried to use it. But thanks for the question.
So, some more questions.
Peter?
Yeah,
Mikko here. I just want to say on behalf of Kungla, thank you for all the years that you've been taking photos for us and been able to, or getting us those copies of that photo so that we have a great record of everything that we've done. And I would say probably the exact same thing would be coming from the Kid Plaza down in Vancouver as well.
Well, thanks, Mikko. I mean, the interesting thing about taking pictures not only of Kungla folk dancers, but also of the choirs, is that back in 2009, when I first applied for accreditation, it was those pictures that I'd taken of Kungla and the choirs that basically got me the first accreditation. So as a sort of an amateur photographer, I look for every opportunity to take all sorts of images because it's all practice. And, you know, the little mutilas that doing their dancing at ldre over the years, basically it's not much of a transition to go from them to what you saw with the big dancers. So I thank you for the opportunity.
Peter, I have a question. When you are so busy, like taking pictures and finding those right angles, do you ever have like time or opportunity to enjoy the music or dancing?
Yes, yeah, good question. Yes to the music, because to be honest with you, as you know, the Song Festival goes on for hours and hours and hours. And one can actually take breaks and simply say, I want to listen to the music. The dance festival, on the other hand, is just over 2 hours. And it is so action-packed that I really honestly can't say that I could just sit back and say, I just want to watch the dancing. Because you are so excited and thrilled by being in positions to take those pictures that you can't stop. So yes, but no to the other, for those reasons.
May I ask a question?
Sure, Danvi.
You talked about the ethics of photography by an accredited photographer. We have a friend who is a journalist, a photographer in Eesti, and he has a personal ethic never to publish unflattering photos of public figures. Is there something similar for you?
Yes, it's, you know, I've over the years I have quite a collection of pictures that you would describe as unflattering, and I have, to the best of my knowledge, never tried to share them because it does you no good from a reputational point of view to be showing pictures that are unflattering. And so I personally would ascribe to that too. Having said that, there are a lot of people, especially women, who think that virtually every picture of them is unflattering, and I can't help that. But by and large, if there's something that, for example, somebody eating food or with a very awkward expression on their face, I've noticed, by the way, just out of curiosity, that lots of times there are some speakers who I simply have to take dozens of pictures to get a picture that doesn't look awkward with the way in which their mouth moves. I don't know why that is, but certainly I would agree, never deliberately to take an unflattering picture or to post it. You can take it, but it's a matter of posting it that's important.
Until we get
Peter, it's Lily Valke-Kostelek here. I wanted to in total at laulupidu and tantsupidu, if you want to divulge that information.
Sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
Lily, repeat your question, please.
She's muted right now.
On mute.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got an unstable connection, I think. I wanted to know how many photos you took of laulupidu and tantsupidu, or if you even kept track of that, because I'm impressed that you were able to pare it down to the number of photos you presented today.
Well, I can. That's actually a very common question to have asked, and I'll give you the answer with some explanations. Probably over the course of the 4 days, starting from the dress rehearsal, I would say something in the vicinity of 15 to 20,000 pictures. However, remember that I was showing you, telling you about the 6 frames per second. So you can shoot 6 frames a second with virtually everything, for example, dancing. And then when you go back to the hotel, or if you do have some spare time, you can basically, what photographers will call in camera, delete the ones that don't work, the ones where the eyes are closed and so on. So it's a little bit artificial to say that I took that many pictures, because some of it was deliberately done just for the point of capturing that one picture. Every once in a while, you also get some that are completely out of focus. You'll get some that somebody inadvertently gets in your way. So a lot of these things, typically after you finish the shooting, you can delete. When I came home to generate the 1,024 pictures that I ultimately sent to Davi Dumptic, I probably only had at that time about 5,000 pictures to work from. And again, many of them were very close to each other, and I just wanted to have a big screen to see whether one was better than the other. So although it may sound dramatic to have 10 or 15,000 pictures taken, it really isn't that dramatic. And fortunately, with digital cameras, the film is cheap. So I hope that helps.
Peter, I had 2 questions. You said that you took photos of the receptionist of your hotel. Where was your hotel? And you said that you took a number of photos of your relatives. Where are your relatives from? Where did your folks come from?
So basically, the answer to the first question is Karin Bøld mom Lil is the reservations manager for the Nordic Forum Hotel, which was actually in the picture that Kathy took from up above. It's right across the street from the Viru.
Ah, okay.
Right. So it's sort of got a sort of a purplish sort of facade to it, about 6 or 7 stories, 6 stories high total. Wonderful hotel, fantastic breakfast, but I'm not paid to advertise, so I won't go any further. With respect to my relatives, the cousins that were in those pictures were both from around Tallinn. And one was from my father's side, the other was from my mother's side. And again, as little kids in choirs, as I said before, you never know whether they're ever going to be there again. One of the interesting facts that we learned from the media, which I'm sure many people in Estonia and this audience would be aware of, is that as of right now, approximately 50% of the Estonian-speaking people in Estonia have at one time in their life participated in the Song or Dance Festival, 50%. So half the population at some time in their life has participated in the festival. But you never know whether that is going to be a recurring thing for my young cousins or whether that was the only one. So that's why I was so very keen on making sure that I had those group pictures. And of course, I have some close-up pictures too that I didn't want to bedraggle the audience with here tonight.
Peter, is that backdrop that you have right now, is that from your hotel window?
It's not from the hotel window, but it's from the upper floor swimming room and spa at the Nordic Forum.
Okay.
So close.
Nice. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's a beautiful view from up there.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter. I wanted to echo Mikko's sentiments as the representative of the choirs. You've always been a great friend to us and always made us look better than we probably think we look over the years. And I appreciate how good you look in the posed photos and all of that kind of stuff. And I realize how much work goes into making sure we all look the right in the backdrop and all those kinds of things. On a personal note, though, I have to thank you so much. As a frequent subject of your photography, whether I like it or not, I love the action shots you take of me, and I understand the theory of that. But what really I want to thank you for is I've noticed, and maybe you're stalking me or something, but you have taken a lot of these quiet moments at events where I'm like inside myself or I'm doing my own thing, and you've captured that moment that wasn't a public moment. It was a private moment, but somehow you've captured that photo. And I'm just so impressed at how you found that moment and captured it so well.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. If it wasn't obvious from the presentation, choir conductors are great subjects. They're great subjects. They must have a conductor school that has a whole course on animation. And it's very, very easy typically to get great pictures of conductors. So as Ingrid mentioned, one of the most important things is to look for a pleasing backdrop, which isn't always easy. So if you just sort of stand and automatically click away, you may not get the most pleasing backdrop for your subject. As far as the quiet moments are concerned, I think that when I'm photographing, I tend to be doing it 100% of the time. So I'm constantly looking around for things that might be interesting and flattering. as opposed to looking for people eating their food. So that's a sort of a key lesson.
Maybe until we get the other questions, there is a comment from Aili Saun. She says that thank you, Peeter, for putting photos of Paul Lillakas and Toomas Saun into your presentation to show how our young people are carrying our wonderful traditions and proud of their heritage.
Well, thank you, Maëlys, for that comment. You know, as I said during the presentation, it was really lucky to even get 3 people to be in the image, because in the limited space that one has to be really, really lucky to have those people by the rails accessible to the telephoto. So there's a lot of luck involved in these things. And as I said in my sort of semi-facetious comments about the group photos, I would never, ever promise anybody that I could take a picture of them unless they were at Freedom Square or some pre-assigned place. Because trying to hope that you could ever find somebody in a mass of 35,000 is proverbially like the needle in the haystack. One of the other comments that I might make, especially for the non-Estonians in the audience, you may have noticed in all the pictures that most of the people in the pictures had costumes that were matching. Whereas the Toronto, the Hamilton, the New York, and the Vancouver people had a mishmash of costumes. And the reason for that, as all of us here on this audience would know, is that those costumes were heritage costumes from our ancestors. And therefore, because our ancestors came from various different parts of the country, the Toronto group, the Hamilton group, the Vancouver group and New York group do not have the same costumes. Whereas everybody in Estonia, they belong to a certain choir, they come from a certain village, everybody has uniform costumes. And one of the really interesting features of that when taking pictures of folk dancing is that oftentimes the Gungla group, as Mikko and the other Gungla dancers would know, are put at the periphery because their hybrid costumes don't fit the patterns that belong in the middle of the dance floor. But that becomes a great plus for the photographer, because if they're ever in the middle, it would be virtually impossible to get pictures of them. Whereas when they were at the edge, the way they were right under the torch, it was actually relatively easy, once I got rid of the bushes, to get pictures of them. So that's a little bit of background in terms of why some look like a medley of costumes and why the vast majority of Estonian choirs and folk dancers have the same costumes. It's really quite a remarkable indication of the diaspora and our role in that.
So, do we have any more questions or comments or thank yous? Now that's the time to say your thank yous also. When are you going to have your next exhibit, Peeter?
Oh, I don't know. I'm working on the COVID talk now.
Yeah.
But hopefully sometime in the future, and hopefully we can do this in person at some future time. But I really wanted to thank all of you for participating. As I've said to Davi on many occasions when he posts the pictures, it's really no fun taking the pictures and having them on your own desktop. They have to be shared. Very much like Richard and Steve and Rick share their pictures day in and day out in the newspaper, so too one has to share the pictures on ASTL's website for it to have any meaning whatsoever. So thank you all for participating, and thank you all for checking in once in a while on ASTL just to see what's happening photographically.
And many thanks to you, Peeter. Suur aitäh, tõesti. Very exciting talk and wonderful pictures.
Thank you. Be safe, everybody.
Thanks for joining us.